The conference room on the 41st floor held 22 people, and the particular silence that forms when no one knows what to do next. It was a Thursday in late October, and the quarterly strategy presentation had just ended in a way nobody anticipated. Not the associates at the far end of the table who were checking their phones under the lip of the table, not the senior vice presidents who had prepared for this meeting for 6 weeks. Not even Marcus Webb, who had convened it, who sat at the head of the table in a charcoal suit that cost more than most of his staff made in a month, and who had not moved since the young woman at the front of the room finished speaking. Nobody clapped. There were 22 people in that room, and not one of them made a sound. Teacher Sims stood at the presentation screen with her hands clasped in front of her, the way she always held them when she was trying not to fidget. And she waited. The pointer she had borrowed from the supply closet was in her right hand. She had been in the building for 11 weeks. Her badge still had the word Inter printed across the bottom in small block letters, and she had been so careful to tuck the lanyard inside her blazer before she walked to the front of the room. She was 23 years old. She had taken 2 buses and a 40-minute walk in the rain to get to this job every morning for 11 weeks, because she could not afford the parking structure. She had eaten lunch at her desk every single day because the $11 salads in the lobby were outside her budget and the break room was crowded, and she did not yet know anyone well enough to sit with them. She had been assigned a project that nobody else wanted, a dead-end analysis of the company's regional distribution bottlenecks, because the director who handed it to her believed it would keep her quiet and occupied through the duration of her internship. She had finished it in 3 weeks, then she kept going. What she did not know, standing at that screen in borrowed shoes she had polished the night before, was that Marcus Webb had not looked at the clock once in 40 minutes. And Marcus looked at the clock in every meeting. If anyone had asked Deja in the days before that Thursday how she expected her presentation to land, she would have told them honestly that she was not sure it would land at all. She had requested the time on the agenda twice. The first request had gone unanswered. The second had been approved with a 1-sentence reply from the director's assistant that said only 15 minutes, end of agenda. End of agenda meant the part of the meeting where people had already gathered their things. End of agenda meant the room would be distracted and halfway out the door. She had 40 minutes of material. She cut it to 22. She was 3 minutes in before she noticed that Marcus had set down his pen. His name was spoken in the building the way weather is spoken about in a place where the weather can be severe. He had founded Verity Logistics 17 years ago from a borrowed office space with a folding table and 1 laptop. He had grown it to a company with 6 regional hubs and 412 employees and contracts with 11 of the largest retail chains on the Eastern Seaboard. He was 58 years old. He had been in the building that morning since 6:45. He had in the past 12 months sat through 117 meetings by his own count, which he kept because he had learned that the meetings were where the truth went to hide, buried under slides, and projected confidence and people telling him what he already knew. He had not learned anything in a meeting in a long time. He was learning something now. Deja Sims had spent 11 weeks being invisible, and she had used every minute of it to look. She had looked at the way the regional distribution data aligned against the company's delivery windows, and she had found a pattern in the misalignment that the senior analysts had missed because they were looking at each region separately, the way they had always looked at them. She had looked at them together, mapped against each other, and she had found that 3 of the 6 hubs were operating on scheduling logic that had been imported from a model the company built in 2009, a model that predated 2 of the 6 hubs' existence. A model that had never been updated because updating it would have required someone to admit it needed updating. She had found $240,000 of annual waste in the gap between the old model and the current reality. And she kept looking. She found more. She had built a new model. She had tested it against 3 years of the company's own historical data. She had projected the savings over 5 years. The number she put on the screen was not a guess. It was sourced and footnoted and could be audited against data that already existed in the company's own system. $1.4 million over 5 years. The room was very quiet. She had 4 more slides. She got through all 4 of them, and then she said, "That's Everything. I have. And she stood with her hands clasped, and she waited for the kind of polite, absent acknowledgement she had told herself to expect. A few murmurs, maybe. The director saying, "Thank you. That was interesting," in the voice that meant it was not interesting, and then someone changing the subject back to the quarterly targets. Nobody moved. Marcus was looking at her. He was not looking at his phone, not at the slide, not at the window. He was looking at her face. His expression was not easily read. He had a way of absorbing information that made him look still in a way that could be mistaken for inattention, but his assistant of 9 years could have told anyone in the room that the stillness was the opposite. The stillness meant he was working. He reached forward and he picked up his pen. He wrote something on the legal pad in front of him. Then Marcus, founder and chairman of Verity Logistics, who had not stood in a meeting except to leave it in 3 years, got to his feet. He clapped. Once, twice, the sound sharp and deliberate in the silence. And then several other hands came up around the table, uncertain at first, and then not uncertain, and the room found its response in the 4 seconds after his, because that was how the room worked. That was how rooms like that always worked. Deja did not know any of that yet. She just saw a man she had never spoken to stand up, and her hands tightened around the borrowed pointer, and she did not cry because she had promised herself in the bathroom that morning that she would not cry until she got back to her desk. She almost made it. If you have ever been the youngest person in a room where your ideas were worth more than anyone acknowledged, leave a comment. Stay with this story. It is not finished yet. Deja had grown up in a house in southwest Baltimore where the heat worked. 8 months of the year, and the other 4 months, you wore what you had to bed. Her mother, Carol, worked the overnight shift at a commercial laundry facility outside the city and slept from 7 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, and had still found a way to attend every parent conference and school play and junior year college visit that mattered. Carol Sims was a woman who believed in 2 things with her whole body. She believed God did not waste suffering, and she believed that education was the only door that did not need someone else's permission to open. She had told Dea both of those things enough times that Dea had stopped hearing them. The way you stop hearing the sound of the refrigerator, and then one afternoon, in 10th grade, Dea had written them down in a notebook and realized they were true. She was the first person in her immediate family to attend a 4-year university. She had gotten a partial scholarship and taken out federal loans for the rest and worked 16 hours a week at a campus dining facility for 2 years until she qualified for a work-study position in the economics department that paid slightly more and smelled better. She graduated with a 3.9 GPA and a degree in supply chain economics, and she had applied to 41 jobs in her final semester and heard back from 6 and been interviewed by 3 and offered 1. The internship at Verity Logistics paid $17 an hour. It was 22 miles from the room she was renting in a house with 3 other people. The room was $470 a month, and the lease required first and last, which she had paid with her final student loan disbursement. The internship was described in the posting as a pathway to potential full-time employment. Every internship posting said that. She took it anyway. The morning routine began at 5:45. She set the alarm for 5:45 because the first bus came at 6:12 and the 6:12 bus connected to the second bus at a transfer point where the wait was 12 minutes in good weather and longer in bad, and she had learned in her first week that if she missed the 6:12 she would arrive to the building at 9:03, which was 3 minutes late, and she was not willing to be 3 minutes late. She was not willing to give anyone that. She ate toast standing up in the small kitchen, and she fixed her badge lanyard so it hung inside her collar, and she wore the blazer over whatever she had clean. And she walked 2 blocks to the stop, and she waited. She got to the building by 7:52 every morning. The lobby security desk logged her entry at the turnstile. She knew the security guard's name was Leonard because she had read it on his badge, and she said good morning to him every day. And by the 3rd week, Leonard said good morning back without looking up from the monitor, which meant he had started expecting her. And that was a small thing, but she noted it the way she noted all small things. She was building a record of what was real and what was performance, and she had learned early that the two were not always the same. She showed up the first day in the blazer she had bought for $8 at a consignment shop and spent an evening pressing flat, and the director, a man named Doug Farris, who managed the analytics division, had looked at her ID badge with the Intern notation and handed her a project summary in a manila folder and said, "Get started on this." Nobody's had time for it. He did not say welcome. He did not learn her name for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, she sat at a workstation in the far corner of the third-floor analytics pod, the seat nearest the window to the stairwell, which meant people passed behind her when they used the stairs, and rarely looked at what she was working on. She had 3 colleagues in the immediate vicinity. 2 of them were junior analysts who were 3 and 4 years older than she was and who spent roughly 40% of their conversational energy discussing the project management software they hated, and roughly 40% discussing a particular senior analyst they also hated, and roughly 20% talking about actual work. The third was a contractor named Roy, who came in Tuesdays and Thursdays and never spoke to anyone. She tried once. Roy nodded. She let it go. She learned most of what she needed to know about the division by listening to the junior analysts, who had worked there long enough to know where the bodies were buried and young enough to be careless about where they said so. The project he handed her was a distribution analysis that had been sitting in a shared folder-marked backlog since the spring, when a junior analyst had started it and been pulled off it for something more pressing and never returned. The existing file was 40 slides of raw data with no synthesis and several notes in the margins that said things like, "Figure this out later." Deja read through all 40 slides on her first afternoon. She started building a structure. By Friday of her first week, she had a clear sense of what the analysis was actually asking, which was different from what Doug Farris thought it was asking. She did not tell him that yet. She kept her head down. She wore headphones at her desk, not because she was listening to anything, but because headphones were the universal signal in an open-floor office that a person was occupied and not available for the casual dismissals that accumulate when you are new and young and a woman and none of the people around you have quite decided what category to put you in. She listened to the conversations around her instead. She listened to what the senior analysts complained about over their lunch orders. She listened to what the regional managers said in the hallway about the quarterly numbers. She was building a map of the place, and she was doing it quietly because quiet was the only option available to her. The distribution model problem emerged from 3 weeks of that listening. She had a yellow legal pad on her desk. She was not a digital note person, not for the first pass on something new. She filled 14 pages in those 3 weeks. Not analysis yet, just observation. The word she put at the top of the first page on her first afternoon was the same word she had put at the top of first pages since 10th grade. The word her economics teacher had written on the whiteboard the first day of class and never erased for the entire semester. The word was why. Not what the data showed, why it showed that. She was working with the backlog file, the 40 slides of raw regional data, and she was also doing what the original analyst had clearly not done, which was pulling the actual routing logs from the shared drive and laying them next to the model outputs and asking why the numbers did not always match. They were close. They were close enough that anyone checking casually would not have flagged it. But she was not checking casually. She was sitting at a workstation by a stairwell at 7:52 every morning asking why, and the gap between the model and reality was a consistent gap, not random variance. And consistent gaps have sources. The company had 6 regional hubs. The hubs had been added over time as the company grew, and the routing and scheduling logic that governed them had been adapted from the original 2009 model rather than rebuilt, because rebuilding would have required a capital expenditure approval that nobody wanted to request and a project timeline that nobody wanted to own. The model worked, it worked well enough, in a company that was profitable and growing well enough, is a very effective argument for leaving things alone. What Deja found was the space between well enough and better. She found it in the timestamp data. The original 2009 model had been built around a 6-hour standard transfer window between hubs, which reflected the road distances and carrier capacities available in 2009. 2 of the 6 hubs had been added in 2014 and 2017, and their distances and carrier relationships were different, and the model's 6-hour window did not fit them the way it fit the original 4. Nobody had recalibrated the window. The scheduling logic had simply been applied, and it fit the new hubs the way a coat fits a person it was not made for. Which is to say, well enough to wear, but not right. Deja recalibrated the window for each hub individually and ran the numbers against 3 years of historical transfer data, and the gap closed. Then she looked at what it would have meant financially if the gap had been closed 2 years ago when the 6th hub came online. The number was significant. She checked it 3 times. It held. She found it in the data she had access to as part of her assigned project and in the shared drive where the regional performance reports lived, which were technically accessible to anyone with a Verity login, which included interns. She spent 3 weeks building the analysis. She spent a 4th week pressure testing it against every scenario she could generate from the historical data. She spent a 5th week writing it up in a format that was clear and defensible and that a room full of senior people could absorb in under 25 minutes. Then she sent the request for meeting time to Doug's assistant. Doug received the request on a Monday morning. He read the subject line which said, Distribution Model Analysis, Q4 Findings, and he assumed it was the backlog project he had handed her on day 1, finally completed, and he slotted it into the end of the next Thursday strategy meeting without much thought. He did not ask to see the materials in advance. He did not tell her the meeting included the chairman. He assumed she would present her 40 slides of raw data, and he would say it was good work and move on to the next item. He was the only person in the room on Thursday who spent the first 3 minutes of her presentation waiting to leave. By minute 7, Doug was sitting very still. By minute 14, he had turned to look at Marcus twice and stopped himself the second time. By the time Deja said, "That's everything I have," Doug understood 3 things simultaneously. The first was that the analysis was correct. He had spent enough years with the company's data to know the difference between a model that was speculative and one that was grounded, and hers was grounded. The second was that nobody in his division had found what she found, because nobody in his division had looked at the regional data the way she had looked at it. The third was that he had handed her this project because he thought she was nobody, and she had turned it into something that was going to change the company's operations, and that was going to be attached to her name. He sat with those 3 things while the room clapped. Marcus remained standing. He let the applause settle, and then he said, "What's your name?" She told him. "How long have you been here?" 11 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the screen which still showed her final slide, the one with the 5-year projection. Then he looked back at her. "Can you present this to the operations team?" "Full version. Yes," she said. "I have 22 minutes that I cut for time." Someone at the far end of the table made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Don't cut anything," Marcus said. He picked up a legal pad and he sat down and he wrote for a moment, and then he tore the top page off and folded it and set it aside. And the meeting moved to close, and Deja walked back to the seat someone had saved for her at the very end of the table, the intern's seat, the one nearest the door, and she sat down and put the borrowed pointer in her bag and looked at her hands and allowed herself exactly 1 breath that was not entirely steady. The director's assistant sent her a calendar hold for the following Tuesday. She did not sleep much that weekend. There is a kind of recognition that arrives so long after it was earned that when it finally comes, it does not feel like arrival. It feels like proof. It feels like the ground under your feet telling you it was solid all along, that you were not wrong to keep walking, that the road was real even when you could not see it. Deja had kept walking for 23 years without anyone in a position of power telling her she was on the right road, and so when Tuesday came and she stood in front of the operations team and gave the full 22 minutes and the room asked questions for 40 more, she felt something she did not have a word for until later. Until she called her mother from the parking lot of the building, and Carol Sims picked up on the second ring the way she always did. "They listened," Deja said. Carol said, "Baby, I know." They actually listened. "I know," her mother said. And then there was a pause that held more than the words did, and Carol said quietly, "Was there any doubt?" There had been. There had been 11 weeks of it, $470 a month of it, 2 buses and a long walk of it, $8 blazer of it. But Deja did not say that, because her mother already knew. The operations team meeting was on a Tuesday. 2 weeks after the original presentation, Deja arrived 8 minutes early and set up the projector herself and arranged the printed copies of the methodology document at each seat. 3-hole punched in a thin binder with her name on the cover, not because anyone had asked for printed copies, but because she had learned that printed copies in a room full of people who expected slides told a room something about how seriously the presenter took what she was saying. The operations team had 7 members. 6 of them had been with the company more than 5 years. The 7th, a regional director named Cal, had been there 11. Cal was the kind of man who asked questions in meetings the way a surgeon asks questions during a procedure, precise and undecorated, and 3 minutes into Deja's extended presentation, Cal raised his hand and asked about the Hub 4 transfer data, specifically about how she had accounted for the seasonal carrier variance in the 4th quarter. She had accounted for it. She walked him through it. Cal made a note and said, "Okay," and did not interrupt again for 9 minutes, and the next time he raised his hand, he said, "What would phase 2 look like?" And that was when Deja understood the meeting had changed shape. The operations team approved the distribution model revision inside 30 days. The project was assigned a budget and a 3-person team to implement it. Marcus sent an email to the full analytics division, which was the first email he had sent to the full division in 2 years, and in it he named Deja and her project and said that her work represented exactly what the company was supposed to be doing with data and was not doing enough of, and that he wanted everyone in the division to read her methodology document, which was attached. Doug replied to that email. It took him 45 minutes to write the reply, and he deleted the first 3 drafts. What he eventually sent was 3 sentences long and said that the work was excellent and that his team was proud to have supported it. Deja saw the email. She read it twice. She did not respond. She thought about responding. She thought about it, sitting at the workstation by the stairwell window in the seat she had occupied for 11 weeks, and she considered what a response would say and what it would cost and what it would buy, and she decided that it would cost more than it bought. She had not been supported. She had been handed a dead assignment and left alone in a corner seat. And the work had happened despite that, not because of it. There was a version of this moment where she said so, and there was a version where she let the record speak without her commentary, and she chose the second version for reasons that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with energy. She had better things to spend it on. She had a meeting with Marcus's assistant the following morning. The meeting was in Marcus's actual office, not a conference room, and his office had a window that looked south over the city and a round table with 4 chairs and books on the shelves that were not decorative. He was already at the table when she came in. He had 3 questions. The first was about her educational background. The second was about her 5-year methodology, specifically about her weighting she had applied to the hub-to-hub transfer cost that he had been thinking about since Thursday and that he wanted her to walk him through. She walked him through it. It took 9 minutes. He listened in the way she was learning to recognize, the way that meant the stillness was attention and not absence. When she finished, he asked one clarifying question about the carrier assumptions she had used for the 6th hub, and she answered it, and he wrote something down, and then he set the pen on the table. "The weighting's right," he said. "Not congratulations, just confirmation." She appreciated that more than congratulations. The third question was whether she had accepted another position. She had not accepted another position. She had 2 interviews scheduled with other companies, because her internship ended in 3 weeks and she did not know what was going to happen. And you did not sit on 2 buses for 11 weeks to end up without options. One interview was with a regional freight company that had contacted her through the university's career services office. The other was with a consulting firm downtown that paid entry-level analysts $44,000 a year and had a formal review at 18 months. She had prepared for both. She had also prepared for the possibility that neither one would come through, because that was how she had been raised, to prepare for the road that did not appear and walk it anyway. She told him she had not accepted another position. "Wad," he said, "I'd like to offer you one." He told her what it was. It was not an entry-level analyst position, which was what she had assumed she would be offered if she was offered anything, which she had not assumed. Was a position that did not currently exist, that he wanted to create, that would sit inside the operations leadership structure rather than the analytics division, and that would have her working directly on distribution and logistics optimization across all 6 hubs. He described the scope in 2 minutes, the same economy of language she had noticed in the meeting. No decorative reassurance, just what it was and what it required. She listened without interrupting. The salary he named was $61,000 a year. She was quiet for a moment. "That's not what I expected," she said. "I know," he said. She asked if she could have 48 hours to think about it. He said yes. She took 26. She spent those 26 hours doing what she always did when a decision was in front of her. She made a list on paper. Not pros and cons. She did not believe in pros and cons columns because they implied equivalence of weight, but a straightforward list of facts. The salary would pay off the first year of her student loans and cover her rent with a margin. The role was positioned inside operations leadership rather than the analytics bench, which meant her ceiling was different. The work was the distribution optimization work she had already started and understood better than anyone else in the building. The company was growing. The chairman had stood up. He crossed out 2 items on the list as redundant and added one she had forgotten, which was that she had eaten lunch at a desk for 11 weeks and the break room had never felt like a place for her, and that was a small thing, but small things accumulated. Then she folded the list and put it in her bag, and she was ready. She called her mother from the parking lot again. Carol answered on the 2nd ring. Again. Deja told her the number, and Carol was quiet for a moment, and then she said, 61,000. Yes. Another pause. Lord, Carol said softly. It was not an exclamation. It was the way she said the word when something was too large for ordinary language and she needed to hand it somewhere larger than herself. Deja accepted the offer on a Thursday, exactly 2 weeks after the presentation. She sent the formal email at 8:43 in the morning before she got on the first bus because she did not want to wait until she arrived. She was still wearing the same blazer. She had not yet been paid enough to replace it. She wore it anyway because it had been in the room when it happened, and she was not ready to put it away. What she did not find out until much later, until the kind of later that comes after you have been somewhere long enough to know the texture of the place and the people in it, was the note. Marcus had written something on the legal pad during her presentation, and he had torn the page off and folded it, and he had given it to his assistant after the meeting with instructions to add it to the project file he kept, a personal record he maintained separately from the company's official documentation, a running account of the things he thought mattered. The note said, "Find out who she is. Do not lose her." His assistant, a woman named Patricia, who had worked for him for 9 years and who had seen him write notes like that exactly twice before in her tenure, had flagged Deja's personnel file within 10 minutes of the meeting's end. She had flagged it with a small green star in the internal system, which was a designation she used for things Marcus had specifically asked her to track, and she had sent him a 1-line summary of Deja's background. Baltimore, partial scholarship, 3.9 GPA, supply chain economics, first generation. Marcus had read that summary sitting in a hallway between meetings, and he had sat with it for a moment before he moved on. He had grown up in a house in East Baltimore. His mother had worked 2 jobs. He had gotten a scholarship, a partial one, and worked the rest, and he had arrived in the professional world without a single person in a position of power recognizing what he was before he had made himself impossible to ignore. He had built a company that employed 412 people, and he had not thought about that particular cost, the cost of invisibility, the years you spend proving what should have been apparent in a long time. Deja had walked into his building on a Tuesday morning 11 weeks ago, and she had been invisible, and she had done the work anyway. That was the thing he had written on the legal pad, not who she was, what she was. He had seen it in 3 minutes and done nothing for 8 weeks because he had not been in the room for 8 weeks, because the room, the one where she did her actual work, was not a room he entered. He thought about that too. He made a change after that. It was not announced, and it was not dramatic. He began eating lunch in the break room on the 3rd floor twice a week. His assistant thought he had gone briefly unusual. The third-floor analyst spent the first 2 visits in a state of barely managed alarm, and the third visit in something more like ordinary. And by the fourth, they were talking to him the way people talk when they forget to perform, which was the only kind of talking he had ever been interested in. He found 2 more people in those lunches worth watching. He was not surprised. He was a little ashamed. It had taken this long to look. Deja's first full week in her new position was a Monday in January, and the distribution model implementation was already in its second phase, and 3 of the regional hubs had begun piloting the revised scheduling logic, and the early numbers were tracking within 4% of her projections. She had a desk with a window now, not a view, a window that looked out over the parking structure, but light came through it in the late afternoon, and she had arranged her things on the desk carefully, a small photo of her mother. A notebook she was halfway through, the methodology document printed and 3-hole, punched in a binder, because she was the kind of person who printed things she needed to be able to mark up by hand. The blazer was on the back of her chair. She was not ready to put it away yet. She thought she might never be. It had been in the room when something changed, and she intended to remember what it felt like to stand at the front of that room and not know if anyone was going to respond, to wait in that particular silence with her hands clasped and a borrowed pointer in her hand and her badge tucked inside so no one could read the word at the bottom. She had waited, and the right person had stood up. She pulled the binder open, and she uncapped her pen, and she went to work. 2 years later, the revised distribution model had generated $980,000 in documented savings across the 6 hubs, and the implementation had expanded into a full optimization program with a team of 4 reporting to Deja, and she had been named to the company's emerging leadership cohort .USD, which meant a seat at a quarterly table she had once stood at the front of. She sat at the end, near the window now, not the door. The first time she sat there, Marcus was already at the table when she came in, and he nodded at her the way he nodded at everyone, briefly and with full attention, the way that meant the same thing as the first time. Then the meeting began, and Deja opened her notebook, and the room got quiet, and she listened. Carol drove up from Baltimore on Deja's first official day in the leadership cohort. She drove a car with 172,000 miles on it, and she parked it in the parking structure, and she sat in the car for 2 minutes before she got out, the way she always sat when she arrived somewhere that mattered, quiet and preparing. Always she had taught herself to do overnight shifts in the laundry facility when she needed to collect herself before the door. Then she got out, and she took the elevator up to the 41st floor, where her daughter met her, the lobby. Carol looked at the window wall and the city below it and did not say anything for a moment. She was 61 years old, and she had worked the overnight shift for 20 of those years, and she had attended every conference and school play and junior year college visit, and she had worn the same winter coat for 6 years because a new one was not in the budget. And she was standing in a glass and steel building on the 41st floor on a Tuesday afternoon because her daughter was about to sit at a table where decisions were made, and she wanted to see the room before the meeting started. Then she said, "Tell me about the work." So Deja told her. She told her about the hubs and the model and the phase 2 implementation and the early savings numbers and the team she was building and the things she was learning about how large systems resist change and then yield to it when someone is patient enough to show the data clearly and willing to stand at the front of the room without anyone clapping and "Wait!" She talked for 20 minutes. Carol listened the way she always listened, without interrupting, with her full attention, with the particular expression she had when something mattered, an expression that did not look like pride so much as it looked like recognition. The face of a woman watching a thing she had always known was true, become visible to the rest of the world at last. When Deja finished, Carol reached into her bag and took out a photograph. It was small, wallet-sized, a school picture from Deja's junior year of high school, the year Carol had told her that education was the only door that did not need someone else's permission to open. "I've carried this since that year," Carol said. "I thought you should have it now." Deja took the photograph. She looked at it for a moment, her younger face looking back at her, the girl who had not yet ridden a bus 22 miles to stand at the front of a room when nobody knew her name. She thought about the silence, the 22 people and the room that did not respond. She thought about the borrowed pointer and the tucked-in badge and the $8 blazer, pressed flat the night before. She thought about what it had felt like to wait. Then she thought about the sound of one person standing up. She put the photograph in her notebook, in the pocket at the back, where she kept the things she needed to remember. Have you ever watched a room stay silent when it should have responded? Drop a comment below. And if this story moved you, there is another one waiting, about a woman who gave something away that she could not afford to lose and what came back to her when she needed it most. The stories are here when you are ready. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is coincidental.